I want to talk about addiction in a bit more detail here because I'm of the opinion that you can be a holic of all these different substances or behaviors. The traditional description of addiction is that you have withdrawal effects. We definitely see that with sugar. There are people on the other side that have a differing opinion that sugar is not addictive.
Yes, I know.
What are those opinions, and what are your rebuttals to some of those?
So there is a group here in the UK and in Europe called Neurofast, and they believe that in fact the problem is not food addiction, the problem is eating addiction. Well, if that's the case, then there's no specific food that is addictive. Well, what that does is that gives the industry carte blanche to basically put anything they want in. When you look at what they say, first of all, they give alcohol a pass, and then they give caffeine a pass. And well, alcohol, caffeine, I mean, like sugar is not addictive, but alcohol and caffeine are, but you're giving them a pass. Like, how does that work?
Yeah.
They also say sugar is energy and it's necessary for life. Garbage. Where does that come from? Now, it is true that glucose is energy. It is true that your liver can metabolize glucose for energy, and so can your brain, and so can every other organ in your body. That's true. But the question is, do your organs need glucose? And the answer is they need it, but you don't have to consume it to get it, because your body will make it. It will make it out of protein or fat, a process called gluconeogenesis. So, yes, you need glucose, but you don't need to eat glucose. Fructose, the sweet molecule in sugar, there is no biochemical reaction in the body that requires it. It is completely vestigial to all animal life on this planet. And it is a mitochondrial toxin. It inhibits 3 enzymes that are necessary for mitochondria to work properly. It inhibits AMP kinase, the fuel gauge on the liver cell. It inhibits ACAD-L, which is one of the enzymes that helps chop up the fatty acids into 2 carbon fragments so that they can be oxidized. And also the byproduct of fructose metabolism, uric acid, inhibits carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, which is necessary to regenerate carnitine, which is the shuttle mechanism to get the fatty acids into the mitochondria for oxidation in the first place.
Okay.
In other words, fructose is a chronic dose-dependent mitochondrial toxin. So the fact that it has 4 calories per gram is kind of irrelevant. In the same way that alcohol has 7 calories per gram and is kind of irrelevant. There's no dietitian on the planet who would call alcohol food. Well, there should be no dietitian on the planet that calls sugar food, because it's not necessary. It is not a nutrient. Just because it's energy doesn't make it a nutrient. In fact, sugar is not food. Okay? The definition of food. What is the definition of food? Substrate that contributes either growth or burning of an organism. Well, I've just shown you that sugar actually inhibits burning because it inhibits mitochondrial ATP generation. How about growth? My colleague, Dr. Efrat Mansinigo Ornan at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, head of the Department of Nutrition, has shown that sugar actually impairs linear growth. It impairs cortical growth. It impairs trabecular growth. Right? It hijacks growth. It promotes cancer growth through fermentation, through the Warburg effect, but it in fact actually inhibits growth. So if a substrate actually inhibits burning and inhibits growth, is it a food? In fact, sugar is not a food. Sugar is a food additive.
Okay.
That's what sugar is.
Yeah.
And we have plenty of data to support food additive addiction. So this is where the argument becomes actually not just semantic.
Yeah.
food versus eating addiction. Ultimately, what we're talking about is food additive addiction. And that's one of the things I'm trying to, promote and get across to both the public and to NeuroFast, because, they got to get with the friggin' program.
Yeah. And with the just on that point around food addiction, I think it also comes down to how socially acceptable some of these items are.
Indeed.
If you take the glib example of smoking, it was very socially acceptable 60, 70 years ago, and it took decades for it to become socially unacceptable. And
Absolutely.
I think we're still at the early stages when it comes to sugar as an additive.
I couldn't agree with you more, Rupy. I mean, smoking went from fashion to filthy habit
Yeah.
in 30 years. Okay? Now, how did that happen? And why did it take 30 years? And the answer is, we taught the children. The children grew up. And they voted. And the naysayers are all dead. Okay? This is a generational shift. And unfortunately requires a generation to be able to see it. In the fact, we have had count them, 4 cultural tectonic shifts, both in the US and UK, over the last 30 years. And here they are. Number 1, bicycle helmets and seatbelts. Number 2, smoking in public places. Number 3, drunk driving. Number 4, condoms in bathrooms. Each of those was basically third rail of politics 30 years ago. If a legislator had stood up in a state house or Congress or Parliament or the Duma or anywhere else in the world and promoted any legislation about any one of those 4 things, they'd have gotten laughed right out of town. Nanny state, liberty interest, get out of my kitchen, get out of my bathroom, get out of my car. Today, they're all facts of life.
Yeah.
No one's belly aching about any of those. Okay. Oh, we're belly aching about new stuff like COVID vaccines. I mean, it's not like we'll ever solve this issue, but those 4, they're settled. There's no arguments about it. You see anybody protesting seatbelts today? Lord Balfour in 1980 stood up in Parliament right across the street over here, okay, and basically told everybody that seatbelts were an affront against their personal liberty. I mean, let's get real here.
Yeah.
All right. This takes a generational shift, and we've done it, and we'll do it with sugar. We're about, I would say, 10 years into the 30-year cycle.
Yeah. I was fascinated by this book as someone, like many people who are recognizing the impact of technology on my own attention, how I feel like I'm constantly flicking around the page rather than following line by line. I was fascinated to dive into this book and dive a little deeper around it. I thought we could perhaps anchor the listener by talking a bit about attention as it is. And you have this wonderful bit actually in the conclusion of the book where you talk with James Williams, the former Google strategist, about attention described as spotlight attention, daylight attention, and there's another type of attention as well. Starlight.
I can go through them.
Yeah. I think that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the book because, I'm guessing pretty much everyone who's listening, I could feel that my own ability to pay attention was getting worse. With each year that passed, it felt like things that require deep focus that are incredibly important to me, reading books, watching films, having proper long conversations, were just getting harder and harder. And I could see this was happening to huge numbers of people around me. The average office worker now focuses on any one task for less than 3 minutes. And for every one child who was identified with serious attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem. So I wanted to understand what was happening to us. And it's interesting you bring up Dr. Williams. Obviously, I used my training in the social sciences at Cambridge University to go on a really big journey all over the world, from Moscow to Miami to Melbourne, to interview over 200 of the leading experts on attention and focus. And what I learned is there's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make it worse. And loads of the factors that can make your attention worse have been hugely rising in recent years. You've mentioned tech. Obviously, there are some aspects of our tech that are doing this one of the things that fascinated me is actually how wide the causes are. That tech is only, it's a substantial part of my book, but it's not the biggest part. The food we eat, an issue obviously very important for your podcast, is hugely affecting our ability to focus. A huge array of factors, the way our offices work, the way our kids' schools work. There's a really big, broad array of these 12 factors. But you've gone to a really interesting, one of the things that really interested me that I learned, which is when we think about attention, we tend to think about it in quite a narrow way as a kind of mild irritant, poor attention problems, right? But actually, Dr. Williams, who I would argue is the most important philosopher of attention in the world, argues there's 3 layers of attention that help us to think about this. I would actually argue there's a 4th, and I know he agrees with this. So the first layer of attention is what we mostly think about when we think about attention problems, and that's what's called your spotlight, right? So your spotlight, you think about the room I'm in now, right? I'm talking to you from my flat. I'm homing in on answering your questions, but actually, I'm surrounded by a load of stuff, right? I can hear, if I zone out a little bit, I can hear the sound of my radiator over there. If I turn my head a little bit, I can see people walking past on the street. I'm surrounded by all my stuff, my books. Somewhere hidden in this room, there's my phone. I'm zoning out all of that, and I'm narrowing down to you. So it's called your spotlight, because it's your ability to narrow down your focus to one immediate task. And we can all feel that our spotlight's being disrupted. I go to the fridge to get a Diet Coke. On the way there, I get a text message from my friend. I start answering. Suddenly, I'm standing in the kitchen. I'm like, why the hell did I come here? I come back to my laptop and I don't have a Diet Coke, right? That kind of disruption is happening to us all the time. And it's having huge consequences that I'm sure we'll talk about. But actually, so that's mostly when we think about attention problems, we think about spotlight disruption. We don't use that term, but that's sort of what we think about, right? I was trying to get something done and I got disrupted and now I'm not doing it, right? And that's huge. But actually, the next level up, Dr. Williams argues, I think persuasively, is even more disruptive. It's what he calls your starlight. And he says that's not just your ability to achieve a short-term goal, like going to the fridge to get a drink. That's your ability to achieve a long-term goal. I want to start a business. I want to write a book. I want to be a good parent, right? It's called your starlight because when you're lost in the desert and you don't have GPS, you look to the stars and you're like, oh yeah, that's the direction I'm traveling in, right? And he argues it's not just our ability to do immediate short-term tasks that's being screwed with, it's our ability to achieve longer-term tasks as well. If you're jammed up all the time, if you're experiencing these 12 factors that I write about in my book, Stolen Focus, you're going to find it harder to do those longer-term projects. Right? I'd say to anyone listening, think about anything you've ever achieved in your life that you're proud of, whether it's starting a business, being a good parent, learning to play the guitar, whatever it is. That thing that you're proud of required a lot of sustained long-term focus. And when your ability to pay attention breaks down, your ability to achieve your goals is diminished. Your ability to solve your problems is diminished. You feel worse about yourself because you actually are less competent. And when you start to get your attention back, obviously you start to feel much better. There's a layer of attention even above that, which Dr. Williams calls your daylight. And that's not your ability to achieve a long-term goal, like starting a business, being a good dad or whatever. That's your ability to even know what your long-term goals are, to even figure out your long-term goals. How do you know what business you want to start? How do you know what kind of book you want to write? How do you know what it means to be a good parent? To figure those things out, you need to have time to think. You need to have rest. You need to let your mind wander. It's called your daylight because you can see a room most clearly when it's flooded with daylight, right? And he argues we're so jammed up that our ability to even figure out who we are is getting harder and harder, right? He calls it decohering, which is kind of fancy term, but I think makes some sense that we become less coherent as people because we can't think clearly. And I would argue there's a layer even above that, which I would call our stadium lights. And that's not just your ability to figure out what your long-term goals are and achieve them as an individual. That's your ability as a society. How do we come together, figure out what our collective goals are and achieve our collective goals, right? We can all see that's getting harder and harder. We can't listen to each other. We end up screaming at each other all the time. We're so polarized. We're so angry. So when you realize what seems like a small thing, oh, my attention's getting worse, it's annoying, you realize that problem hobbles us at every stage of our lives. And crucially, starting to solve the problem means that at every level of our lives, we become more effective as people and better able to achieve our goals and solve our problems.
So what was your relationship with food when you were growing up and as a young woman, and how did that lead to where you are today?
Well, when I was a kid, we didn't know much about food in my family. So I had a Nutella crepe every morning for breakfast.
Right.
My mom had orange juice, Special K with a bunch of sugar on it every morning. And then what happened is that my mother met my stepdad, and he had a brother called David Servan-Schreiber, who was one of the leading French doctors who started educating people on the importance of food for health. And back then, nobody believed that the food you ate could have any impact on your health. So it was quite groundbreaking, but thanks to him, we discovered this whole world, sugar, processed foods versus whole foods, fiber, omega-3s. It was really a revelation. So as a teenager, I started discovering this world, and I really had an affinity for it. I thought it was very interesting. And then what really cemented my interest in health and the body was this freak accident I had when I was 19. And you mentioned you read my book, and in it, there's an X-ray of the hardware I now have in my spine from that accident. It was really terrible. I mean, physically and mentally, I suffered a lot, but it taught me at that young age that nothing is more important than health. And so I went on this quest, this journey to try to figure out, how do I feel good? Because I felt like absolute crap every single day.
Yeah.
And over the years, it led me to glucose. And now here I am. I feel great that I share the science with other people so they can feel good too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Tell me about the accident. Obviously, I know about it, but the listeners, what exactly happened to you?
So I was on vacation with some friends in Hawaii, and they were like, "Hey, let's go jump off this waterfall." So I was like, "Okay, cool." So I jump off of the waterfall, and instead of landing with my feet first, I kind of land sitting down. So one of my vertebrae exploded under the pressure just by hitting the water. And so I was walking around with this broken spine. So I had to have surgery where they went in, took the broken vertebrae out, fused it with the top and the bottom ones. And I was in a lot of pain for a very long time. But then physically, I actually recovered really well because I was 19, So when you're that age, your body can heal quite quickly. So in a matter of months, I was totally fine physically. But mentally, all the stress from the surgery, from the accident, the unprocessed trauma, I think, led to this really intense mental health condition called well, it has a few names, but depersonalization is the clinical name they gave me for the condition, which is just like very deep anxiety about existing. Depression, brain fog, dissociation, impossible to be alone because I was so scared of just being. And that's what started me on this journey to try to understand my body. And that's why I went on to study biochemistry in grad school. Then I worked in genetics because I really wanted to figure out, how do I heal? It was my number one priority in life.
Yeah. And so you did biochemistry first, and then you did math. Is that right? Was that part of your master's?
Math was before. So when I broke my back, I was in my second year of undergrad studying math in London.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. And so after that, you went to work at a very famous genomics company.
Yes.
What was that experience like?
23andMe. It was incredible. So I wanted to work in the field of genetics because I thought, if I can understand my DNA, then I can understand my body and I can figure out how to feel good. The experience was amazing. I mean, the best company, the best people, I had the best job. It was really one of the happiest times of my life, but it did not help me figure out how to feel good, because while your genetics are interesting, they can't tell you what you need to do to wake up in the morning feeling good. And that was a difficult realization I had while I was there.
Yeah. And one of the things that you got experience of was the continuous glucose monitor. That was one of you put yourself up for being one of the guinea pigs. And you very casually mentioned this in the book, but you built your own app to better visualize what was going on with your continuous glucose measurements. And as someone who's just finished completing building their app. I know that it's no mean feat to build an app. So, and you did this, or did you do that on your own? Was that something you just spun up?
So let me tell you the backstory. So
Yeah.
while I was at 23andMe, there was this opportunity to try, as you mentioned, these devices, continuous glucose monitors that you need a prescription for in the US. And so I put one on, and it completely changed my life forever, because finally I was able to see the inside of my body and communicate with my biology in a way that I had been completely incapable of before. And so I learned about glucose, and I saw that glucose spikes were bad, that we had to keep our glucose levels steady. And then I wanted to share the science that I had learned with my friends and my family. I was like, guys, look, like this study shows us that if we have vinegar before our meals, we can avoid glucose spikes and feel better. But my friends didn't react to me just printing the studies and showing them the printed pieces of paper. Like nobody really connects to that. So I thought, how am I going to communicate this important information? So I had this idea of taking data from my glucose monitor and turning it into these graphs that I could show people to illustrate the science. But the problem is the app that the device comes with, it's a medical app. Like it's not something you can just turn into easy to understand graphics. It's just raw data and nothing else. So I had to figure out how to extract the data from that app and then to make my own little illustrations. So yeah, I built a piece of software that did it. I took lots of different pieces from the internet. So the concept was I had to take a screenshot of my daily glucose curve on the app that the device came with. And then I would put this image through a digitizer online that would like extract the data points. And then I wrote this software in this program called R, which I had learned when I was in grad school. Right. And this program then took the data and made these graphs. And the evolution of that is what you see on my Instagram today. Yeah. So then I worked with some engineers to like make it into a proper app. But at the beginning, it was running just on my laptop for, a year. It was just importing my data and running a really startup mode, really like Silicon Valley vibes from my living room. So yeah, I did do that.
That's fab. I've so much respect for that, because I know how difficult it is, to do this on your own as well. And the fact that you're able to spin it up and by yourself is amazing. So, and it's a really cool app.
Thank you. And when you really want to do something, personally, if I really want something to happen, like nothing can get in my way, I will make it happen. And so I spent countless hours building this piece of software to make it work. But I was so determined to doing this because I knew this would change the game. I knew this would help people visualize the science, understand it, become interested in it. And that was my objective, because the stuff I had discovered was so life-changing. I needed to find a way to make it sexy so I could share it and people could then apply it to their own lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let's dive into that. So why is sugar so important? Maybe we could talk about the different names, the relationship between starch, sugars and fiber. And we'll just give us a primer on that.
Sure. So the word I use is glucose. And as you know, glucose is your body's preferred energy source. And we get glucose from the foods we eat. So every time we eat something starchy, like bread, pasta, rice, potatoes, or every time we eat something sweet. So this could be fruit, this could be cookies, this could be cakes, whatever. Every time you eat something starchy or sweet, they break down into glucose in your body. Special mention for the sweet foods also break down to fructose. That's a separate issue. But if you eat something sweet or starchy, glucose is going to land in your bloodstream. And glucose is very important. Like we need it to be able to function properly. But the problem arises when we deliver too much glucose too quickly to our body. It's like if you give a plant too much water and it drowns, or a human too much oxygen and they pass out. Too much glucose creates these glucose spikes, and these glucose spikes have lots of consequences.
But the other thing we've done, and in some ways the most compelling, is that we have looked at the flexibility of the brain after psychedelics. And we've done this in patients, and we've done it in healthy volunteers. And you can very readily see it. If you put a healthy person, a normal person, in a scanner, give them a psychedelic, the brain becomes much more connected. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is one of the crucial factors in why people get important insights when they take psychedelics. But that increased connectivity persists. Now, with our patient studies, and we've only really done this currently in depression, we're doing it in other disorders, but we've done 2 depression studies. And in the first one, we scanned people's brains one day after the trip, because you couldn't really ethically put a depressed person in a scanner and hope to get a therapeutic benefit of the psychedelic. I mean, you might get the benefit, but we couldn't justify that. So we scanned them a day after. And in the second study, we scanned them 3 weeks after. And then we looked at the ability of their brains to change their way of thinking, to switch between different thinking states. And in both states, both the day after and 3 weeks after, the depressed brain was more flexible. And this is really remarkable, the more flexible it was, the better their outcome was at 6 months. So this is almost like a fingerprint, or a measure of the changes in the brain which actually predict outcome in depression. And that's very unusual.
How were you able to challenge their flexibility in that particular study? What measure
So
did you use?
the measure we use is we look at, you look at the whole brain. Now, let me just give you a little bit of the backstory. There are multiple networks in the brain, depending on how sophisticated your analysis is and how many measures you've got. But I mean, simply, there are some very obvious ones we can talk about. You know, there's a visual system, there's a hearing system, there's a speech system, there's the motor system, there's a feeling system, and there's a thinking system. And there are about 3 different thinking systems. There's a self-reflective system, there's a system which gets you out there doing things, analyzing things, and then there's another thinking system which is about the relevance of what's out there to you. So let's say there are 10 big networks in the brain. We can measure them and see how rapidly the brain moves between different ones. So obviously now I'm talking, my auditory network is very active, and my word production network is really, really active, and my visual network is very active because I'm looking at you and seeing if you're agreeing with me, which is great. And other networks aren't so active. So we can see how readily the brain flips between different networks. And after psychedelics, we can see it flips more readily. We see these transitions. They're more of the transitions, basically.
Okay.
And that's really important, because the killer problem in depression is that one of the networks, which we call the default mode network, the network which encodes your sense of self, your value, your self-worth, that becomes over-connected to itself. And it doesn't connect to the rest of the world. So rather than evaluate your thoughts by, say, what other people are doing or saying or written about you, you get locked into this internal rumination, this loop of negative thought. We can break that down. We see that psychedelics break it down, and it stays less tightly connected afterwards.
Yeah, I want to go into the default mode network in a bit more detail,
Okay.
but perhaps before we do that, we can step back slightly and actually talk about what we mean by a psychedelic.
Yes.
What psychedelics we typically talk about from the research point of view, LSD, and DMT, etc., and how those are different from other exogenous molecules that we might use. You know, how does it differ from a nootropic, for example?
Right. Okay, so when we talk about psychedelics, most people are talking about what we call the serotonergic psychedelics. So these are drugs which, like LSD, like DMT, like psilocybin, magic mushroom juice, DMT, of course, is an ayahuasca. They target a particular serotonin receptor in the brain called the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. That receptor it's probably the most interesting receptor in the brain in some ways, because it's for reasons we don't fully understand, it's massively expressed in the very highest parts of our brain, the parts of our brain which make us human. And that's, of course, is why psychedelics, by perturbing those receptors, would change the very highest functions of our brain. So people think differently on psychedelics, but they can still move their arms and legs because it doesn't affect those, those more longer evolved parts of the brain. But there are other kinds of psychedelics, and then there are ones like salvia, which produce, again, a rather similarly disorganized state of brain function, but which are subjectively really quite different and often very unpleasant. And then there's Amanita muscaris, which is it's the GABAergic psychedelic, which is we believe is the mushroom that Alice took to get bigger and smaller, because it produces distortions of size. And then, of course, there's ketamine. Now, ketamine is pharmacologically very different from DMT or psilocybin, but it produces, again, perturbations of brain function which can liberate people from disorders like depression and addiction. Currently, of course, in the UK, it's the only psychedelic we can actually use because it's the only one that's in medicine. So a lot of our clinical work is using ketamine at present, but we're hoping in time that the regulations will change and we'll be able to get hold of psilocybin and maybe DMT.
And how do these differ from other molecules like nootropics?
So nootropics are drugs which promote brain metabolism and brain growth, but they do it in a general way.
Okay. Whereas
psychedelics particularly target one receptor that are localized on a very special set of cells. And let me just explain why these cells are really important. Because your brain is, every human's brain has got more computing power than all the computers on Earth. That's a kind of amazing thing, because your brain is maybe 100 billion neural networks. So then, let me start that one again. Yeah. So, the human brain has more computing power than all the computers on Earth put together. Why is that? Because your brain is made up of about 100 billion neurons, and each neuron is a mini computer. And you think, 100 billion times 100 billion is an awful lot of computing power. Now, what makes those individual computers work as a whole are a particular set of neurons which are located in the cortex. They're called the layer 5 pyramidal cells, and they pull it all together.
Okay.
So they make all the communications in your brain, and that is why we are so clever, and we've got the enormous capacities for everything that humans have. Psychedelics particularly target those neurons, and we don't know why. We don't know why those neurons have got a lot of the 2A receptors. I think it's got something to do with the ability to think differently. I think we know that those receptors are involved in neuroplasticity. We know that those receptors mediate the psychedelic experience. We don't exactly know why they're there, but I think the fact that they're there means that even if major things happen to you, even if you're not taking a psychedelic, like for instance, you suddenly discover how to make fire. I think the encoding of that experience, that's a light bulb moment. Wow, I've done something fundamental. It'll be encoded by a whole set of neurons which are controlled by those 5-HT2A receptors. And if you perturb them, then you change the way you think, and that's why you can break out of thinking patterns which are not necessarily very helpful and get into new ones.
Are there patterns of use across all these different types of psychedelics that we are seeing are more useful in different scenarios of the patient's diagnosis? So are there certain psychedelics that are more useful for treatment refractory depression, for example, or generalized anxiety disorder or PTSD?
It's a bit too early to say. And there are several fundamental differences between the psychedelics, but they're more to do with what we call the kinetics, the time course.
Okay.
So things like DMT, we have to either smoke or inject. It has a very transient effect, maybe 10, 12 minutes. For the clinical studies we're doing with DMT, we infuse it intravenously, lasts about 20 minutes. On the other end, you've got LSD, the trip can last 15, 20 hours, which makes it quite hard actually to use clinically because you have to have people in hospital. So, but if you get the same level of interaction with the receptors in the brain at the same time with any of these drugs, you do get very similar effects. So at present, it's not clear whether a particular psychedelic would have particular utility for a particular disorder. It might turn out to be relevant, but it's going to take a lot more research. We're already just starting this at present.
Yeah. Because of the legality issues, is ketamine the most studied in terms of the psychedelics that we have research on today for all those different conditions, or are we seeing actually that in terms of the weight of evidence for all the other ones, it's almost on par?
So there's a paradox here. ketamine is far and away the most used, but it is the least studied.
Really?
And the reason for that is, I suppose, because it's kind of less interesting, because it's not, the questions that we're asking about ketamine now are being asked because we have done the psychedelic research. The
Okay.
ketamine researchers ketamine was developed as an anesthetic, which, knocks your brain out. People aren't really interested in what's going on in the brain when you're unconscious, because you're unconscious. It's only recently that ketamine's been used in a sub-anesthetic level in order to produce, for instance, an antidepressant effect. And those, it's sort of not been so intellectually interesting. The psychedelic research that has really driven the explosion of neuroscience studies in this field. And now we're desperately keen for the ketamine community to catch up. And in fact, we're beginning to do our own ketamine work because they don't seem to be doing it. So we're going to have to do it for them, I think.
Is there a bit of nervousness because ketamine, I guess, is one of those drugs where it can be abused? I remember seeing in the gum clinic when I used to work in Brighton, we had ketamine users, and they would come in with all different sorts of symptoms and bladder cystitis and quite severe issues of
ketamine dependence is a serious problem, and particularly, as you pointed out, in terms of the chronic cystitis and requiring sometimes people to have their bladders removed, which is a horrible thing to have to do because it takes years off your life because you end up with kidney infections. But there's another side of that story as well, which is that heavy use of ketamine produces a kind of dementia. It produces a state of apathy and lack of energy and lack of foresight, which is almost either like dementia or a bit like some forms of schizophrenia. And that is when ketamine is used recreationally, repeatedly. The thing about ketamine is that you get tolerance to the effect quite rapidly, but you can, what we call, surmount that tolerance. You can overcome it by taking more. So people might start off taking a quarter of a gram of ketamine, and after 3 or 4 months, they're taking 3 grams a night. And that then really does put the pressure on the brain and the bladder. Now, in clinical practice, ketamine is rarely used more than once or twice a week to start with, and then usually it's limited to once a month for maintenance therapy. So maybe over a year you might get 15, 20 doses. That's probably not going to cause tolerance. It doesn't seem to cause tolerance, and it's probably not going to cause problems. But there are situations, particularly the US, where there's not much control over who's getting ketamine, where you can doctor shop. You can in theory, just keep, if you've got enough money, you can just go and see a different doctor a day. Yeah. And there are cases of ketamine dependence developing from the clinical use there.
Huh. When did you get interested in the concept of food and health and how we can utilize nutrition as a means to prevent conditions as well as support treatments and therapy?
Oh, I think there was a sort of background to it, just the way I was brought up. I was still part of that. I'm old, and I was still part of that culture as a child of food being used when you were ill. My mother made beef tea. That was just sort of the culture. It was obvious that you could give people food and it would make them feel better. But I think thinking coherently about it began when there was a study came out, and it must have been in the early 90s, which showed that that societies with high levels of vegetable and fruit consumption had less cancers. It seems bleeding obvious to us now, but anyway, this study came out, and I thought, well, that's interesting. It fulfills it. It says what I think is obvious, but here it is documented. It was an epidemiological study, and I said to myself, well, what would be the effect then of a diet high in fruit and vegetables with people who'd had cancer and we're trying to keep off it returning. So we decided to make a food program about that, asking that question. And we rang, we identified the main cancer hospitals in Britain, and we we tried to find people who could talk to us, and we were met with derision. It was considered an absurd idea, completely absurd. And I thought, well, that's amazing, isn't it? I mean, why would you dismiss that as absurd when you'd just seen this other study? I mean, it was dismissed because it was epidemiological and, not double blind. And, as we now know, those kind of tests are absurd in that world. But anyway, that was really the beginning of seeing how people involved in the world of cancer thought it was silly. And then, so that was one step. Then my sister got breast cancer in her early 40s. And it was a small cell, it wasn't a tumor. It was small cell. It was considered, terminal, actually. And she lives in Northern California. And, she was, very Northern Californian. And she worked in the hospital. She's an occupational therapist working with people with extreme, bad strokes, AIDS, really. Anyway, she did some research and she decided that, contrary to her medical advice, she wasn't going to have chemotherapy. And she had a double mastectomy. And we were all her family, mom and dad and me, were just so shocked by this. And she consulted a cancer nutritionist, and regardless of what everybody said, including her doctors, which was that she was signing her death warrant, she did it. She didn't have chemo, and she did eat, and she did do this thing with supplements, and she's now in her 60s, and she's absolutely fine. As we know, as you know, one case proves nothing. Yeah. But it was incredibly brave of her because, her doctors were writing her off, you'll be dead. And so that, made me think. And then I got cancer, goddammit. And I got multiple myeloma. And I thought, am I going to be as brave as my sister? And I thought, no, I'm not going to be as brave as my sister, because multiple myeloma, is your bone marrow, and it's this. And my husband did a lot of research, and I ended up under the care of Professor Jamie Kavanagh at Barts, and he was very open-minded. And I've had all the conventional. I went on a trial, and I've had the conventional chemotherapy treatments, but I did try and apply everything that I've learned about the role of food and the role of relaxation and meditation and all those things. But it was real, because I didn't ask him how long I'd got, but my husband did, and he said, well, it's usually about 5 years, and then it was 7 years, and I may drop dead tomorrow, but it's getting on for 11 years now. And there's a really excellent book that you probably know by David Servan-Schreiber called, what's it called? Cancer.
Anti-Cancer.
Anti-Cancer. And, that puts together what we know. And what I realized when I was doing this for myself, for my own health, my own survival, is that you just have to be intelligent, because you have to be thoughtful. You have to look at the animal studies. You have to look at the laboratory studies, because there are very few human studies, because, A, they very difficult to do. B, there isn't a lot of money to be made out of discovering that mushroom powder, will help your immune system. And we have a system, we have a medical system. You were trained in it. It has technical brilliance. It has many marvels, but it's terribly, terribly narrow. And I read about one of the things, I'll stop soon, but one of the things I'd read when I got sick was about this study that had been done at the MD Anderson Center in Texas, at Cancer Research Center, about curcumin, the active part of what's it called? Turmeric.
Turmeric.
And so I told Professor Kavanagh about this, and it turned out he had another of his patients who was taking high doses, who actually, I mean, he ended up writing about it in the BMJ. She came back from, when all the options for treating her multiple myeloma ran out. She did this high dose of curcumin and went back to normality. So he says, this needs more study, but, it hasn't been done. Anyway, so when I met you, that's why there was this startling, there was this doctor trained in this, in the system, who was saying, look, this all these other elements make a profound difference to your chances of recovery, to your chances of not getting these sick. They're not miracles. You can't eat turmeric and wacko, your cancer's gone. But, well, that's your story, isn't it, Rupy? And
Yeah.
you came to the kitchen and talked about this. And, from the day, from the week we were making that program, I can't remember what year, whatever year it was, ringing at a cancer specialist, to now, there's been a big, big change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible how influential the food program has been to not just the health and food conversation, but multiple conversations, everything from sugar to GMOs to celebrating baking to the heritage of bread, grains, like all these different spokes of a wheel, all centered around food. And that's why I think it's, people's one of Radio 4's most successful programs anyway. But you've really spearheaded a number of things, and I remember that episode so clearly. It was a real pivotal part of my sort of public speaking career, I guess, if you can call it that.
Really?
The sort of the picture painted in people's heads of a doctor in the kitchen. I believe it was a rabbi. It was Levi Roots.
Yes.
And then
Rabbi Laura. Yeah.